Okay, so we've been talking about prehistory, prehistoric art as a kind of hard to pin down global phenomenon as human beings were starting to get their act together. And in passing, I did show a few objects that originated in Africa. Um, Somebody got a question? No. Okay. So when we move on now, we will be pointing increasingly toward Africa, but I'm still showing just a few other objects here. You're looking at something, well, it is African, but it's not significant to our course in that respect. It's really an image I chose because it's characteristic um, of Neolithic wall painting worldwide. You'll see styles not unlike this one. No one style by any one artist is the same, but you will see a certain, very often quite elegant and sophisticated semi-abstract contour silhouette style of painting figures, both animal and human, in cave or exterior wall paintings in North and South America, in Africa, Asia, and in Europe. This is one. By the way, that's 5 to 4,000, not 5 to 40,000 BCE. That wouldn't be really freaky if it was 5,000 to 40,000 BCE. We'd be in some kind of Stephen King alternate universe or something. So just ignore that extra zero there. Neolithic art of this kind is characterized by readable subject matter to some small extent. In other words, here we can see that there are human beings that are interacting apparently with animals. The ones on the bottom, one of them, at least from this little detail I can see, appears to have some kind of a tool or weapon in a hand. And so that might help to explain what's going on. We could be misinterpreting this, though, right? And that's characteristic of Neolithic art, and one of the reasons we call it Neolithic rather than historical, because we really are still making just educated guesses. Okay, this is the site of Neanderthal art made 115,000 years ago. This is long before we have any art by Homo sapiens. It's also in dispute. This is about half that time later, about 62,000 BCE, found in Spain. It was in the news just very recently, 3 years ago. And that was when it was published as an example of Neanderthal art made in Europe. And it also has had its dating disputed or its origins disputed, in some cases both. As you can see, those are marks made deliberately in a pattern of some kind, signifying something to the mark maker, we don't know what, and constitutes therefore art. And the primary objection in this case is to its being dated to as early as 60-odd thousand years ago, on the main ground that, well, Neanderthals weren't there and they weren't making art until they met Homo sapiens, at which point they were just at the point of extinction anyway. And all of that is now in flux because there's increasing evidence around the world of indisputably pre-Homo sapiens mark making. And in that case, I think I may have an example. The argument is made that, well, those are marks, but we don't know what the purpose was, and we can't ascribe an artistic aspiration to the mark maker. Therefore, it doesn't count. What I guess I'm suggesting here is that, however scholarly and serious and scientifically sound the arguments might or might not be in paleontological art prehistory and its arguments, We're all human beings, and many people have a lot at stake in the retelling of the prehistory of human art making, as they have already built careers on the premises that they rely on in their current and future work. So suddenly to have the rug pulled out from under you and be told fundamentally different facts than you had learned can be a little traumatic for any scholar. It doesn't mean that not that everyone is not trying their hardest to reach a consensus based on evidence. Okay, you're now looking at a part of Oceania that includes Indonesia, north of Australia, and Malaysia to the west of that, Singapore. And right in the middle of our image is Borneo. Borneo is the site of, and the red marker there right next to it on Sulawesi Island. These are the ground zero for some of the most remarkable finds of the last 5 years in world archaeological prehistory. This is a so-called babirusa, or pig deer. Can you see him there on the bottom left? Along with some human negative handprint making, which is a worldwide phenomenon. It's basically the tagging of prehistory. And down on the bottom left is this little animal. Here we've got something a bit like it, which is also Indonesian, and which is again Paleolithic in that it doesn't have any obvious direct representations of humans. It has sort of human-like figures, much smaller than the animal, which some experts are saying are Mesolithic indicators. In other words, human-like figures with strange animal-like heads, or perhaps they're wearing masks that are kind of shooting off, flying through the air around this poor animal and maybe hunting it by drawing it down with rope. It's not clear. In other words, it's prehistoric art, but it's very suggestive of an advanced stage of prehistoric society in Indonesia at a time that precedes anything like it, even in Europe's Chauvet cave site, which I talked about last time, and which predates Lascaux by 15,000 years. You see these little guys here? Okay. Then this came out just at the beginning of this year. I've got a stake there, 43,500 BCE, not 33,500 BCE. I got to change my typos here. On dates, you do not want to have typos on. Archaeologists discovered the world's oldest known cave painting, a life-sized picture of a wild pig that was made at least 45,500 years ago in Yang Tedongne, Sulawesi, that's misspelled, Indonesia. The finding, described in the journal Science Advances on Wednesday, provides the earliest evidence of human settlement of the region. Co-author Maxime Aubert of Australia's Griffith University told the AFP it was found on the island of Sulawesi in 2017 by doctoral student Basran Burhan as part of surveys the team was carrying out with Indonesian authorities. The Liang Tedongne site cave is located in a remote valley enclosed by sheer limestone cliffs about an hour's walk from the nearest road, which helps to explain how it took so long for humans to find it, modern humans to find it. What I want you to notice in this report is that it was made in a news report based on the published findings of a scholarly group that had managed this site for some time in early 2021, which in effect ignores the evidence of previous artworks left by Neanderthal human beings. It was made 45,500 years ago. The earliest evidence of human settlement of the region. Well, of the region, but there is pretty clear evidence of earlier human presence in the general region. What's really more significant is where is it? The oh, now I lost my spot. In effect, what I'm suggesting here is that we will repeatedly see references to the earliest, when it comes to the naming or identification of works of prehistoric art ascribed to actors or authors from no earlier than about 70,000 BCE. This remains the standard in the field, even among those who, in effect, believe different. And that's because until we have really conclusive, indisputable evidence, nobody in the field wants to put themselves out on a limb and then be found to have been woefully mistaken, which is very good. It's what science should do, is follow that procedure. I mention that because, and I don't think I put an image up in it yet. Maybe I did. In Morocco, a so-called Venus figurine was announced a few years back, and was, if it was what it was, undoubtedly the first representational artwork made by any human or hominin ever. And so that was exciting. But the people who announced that then came under scrutiny for the possibility they might have been altering the appearance of the object itself. That's a real danger because, of course, one's whole career can be ruined if you are committing any kind of fraud or even doing something less than completely correct. Okay, now you're looking at human figures, which are, of course, Neolithic. And they were drawn well before the the cave paintings at Lascaux, which, with one single figure's exception in a different part of the Lascaux cave complex near the opening, are entirely made up of Paleolithic images. And this is another problem. The one that I described last time with relation to the Chauvet cave next to or nearby the Lascaux cave, and how to describe one or another as either Paleolithic or Mesolithic. Um, so here we have some of the other so-called Neanderthal cave art. As you can see on the left, something which is rather more typical of what people are presenting now in the last 3 years as Neanderthal art. When the dates are overlapping those of Paleolithic Homo sapiens art, it's usually the vaguer and less organized of the marks that are attributed to Neanderthals, in the absence of more fundamental proof that this group was Neanderthal versus Homo sapiens. I'm not sure if I made that point clearly yet. Let me go to my next file, and that might help. So I'm going out of screen share for a moment.
So this started.
Yeah.
Oh wait. Oh, okay. Sorry. So this has been on my mind for a little bit. Sorry, I'm talking in a room, so I'm a little self-conscious about that. But at this point, with so many contradictions, wouldn't it be better to say that like Paleo, Mesolithic, all that style? Wouldn't it be better to say that those are more styles rather than time periods?
I think that's a very good point, and people are doing that. They are analyzing by style, and many of these are works. I mean, I've only shown a tiny fraction of the number of finds in the past 20 years, but many of the finds are sort of grouped together by stylistic means. So if someone draws a figure with a head that has an extended cranial feature, much like another site's artist did, then they might connect them and group them that way. The thing is, the first part of what you're saying, no. And the reason is that people really want to figure out first whatever they can about the actual facts of when and by whom it was made, even if what they have is only tentative, as it so often is and often will remain in this kind of research, because after all, people are trying their best, but they're just finding these really mysterious things. Um, they still want to try to identify it by, well, obviously first by place, and then based on whatever they can um, reason through based on that, um, try to connect it to whichever group of humans it was made by. I guess it's just human nature that people can't wait, and even if they're not really certain, they'll still want to publish what they do know or what they think they know or what's plausible. It's an exciting field because it is science-based, and so when people do reach consensus, usually it sticks, I would say. But it's also exciting because a lot of art analysis is involved because of such an absence of hard evidence on which facts can be built right away. So there is this room for a lot of guesswork and proposals of alternate explanations of whole sequences of the appearances of these things. And I don't know if that's ever going to change, because this is always in flux, as every week it seems something new is published based on some new discovery or reanalysis of the dating of an old discovery. I guess what I'm saying is, first of all, of course, I'm no specialist, and I'm not being fair, I'm sure, to many specific sites and their projects. Just trying to give the vaguest broad overview of the field right now. But it's exciting because you do have a lot of opportunity for using your imagination and your own sense of logic. At the same time, you should be ready to accept alternate theories and entertain them seriously, which is maybe something that some people could work on. But yeah, you make a very valid point. Why don't people just wait until they really know better, and in the meantime just talk about them as artworks? It's just irresistible, I think. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to move on to Africa proper. So, by the way, we're doing 2 modules of Africa. So Africa 1 here is module 1, and I've broken it up into 2 parts. We're starting early, but we may have 3 parts, I don't know. We already talked about this. I'm just reminding you this actually is an African site, Deep Kloof, the rock shelter in South Africa, and a very important one. This is even more important, I think. It's in the Blombos Cave Complex near Cape Town, South Africa. And it's supremely important, first and foremost, because it's the site of the earliest known sandbag industry. No, that's not correct. Sorry, that's an old joke. I shouldn't tell that joke. This is one of the things that was found in the Blombos Cave around 20 years ago. It's a small object made of ochre stone, a very soft, easy to carve stone, usually in the brown, orange, red color range. And as you can see, if you're looking carefully, not only is it marked with a pattern, but it's also got a notch that's been burnished on the bottom right, which tells us it was a tool, probably used to thread twine or something like that, that ran through that notch for some reason. And then for other reasons than the practical use of this object as a tool, it was decorated. Now that's art. I'm not saying it's a Rembrandt, okay? It's art, though. And it's also been established that it was the first known game of tic-tac-toe. No, it's not. I gotta stop that. Anyway, it's a pattern that's repeated and that uses marks in straight lines at angles and perpendicular lines, parallel lines that obviously would have been made only by human beings. And it's from probably about the nearer end of the date range that has been cited, 68,000 years ago, or around 66,000 BCE. There are some who insist on the basis of some other artifacts nearby that it probably dates as early as 100,000 BCE. That wouldn't be out of the question, so it's not been eliminated yet. Now, yeah, you can call it by the site, name this work by the site it's found in. This would be MI6 from the Blombos Cave, which would, of course, then imply to anyone who's familiar with the Blombos Cave findings a certain style of geometric, repeating, symmetrical, non-representational, decorative design, as opposed to, say, figures hunting animals, which would be a very different style. But no matter how much you want to do that, you're always going to come back to people wanting to establish when it was made, not just for the abstract knowledge itself, or the concrete knowledge itself, but because in some cases anyway, there are people who want to establish that it was or wasn't the work of Homo sapiens. This is a clamshell. It's not a very good photo, I'm sorry. The clamshell was marked. It was marked with straight lines at a zigzag angle pattern, about not much less than 500,000 years ago, found in 1891. There, a raking light photo that shows you those marks. And here is a really good comment, I think, revealing of the state of the field today. Maybe the person thought it was attractive. This was made recently by a person in the field, a professional archaeologist. Maybe the person thought it was attractive and was motivated to make another line. And before you know it, there was a drawing. Jose Jordans, researcher at Leiden University. I think the person did his or her best to make something that looks good. Do you see how, whether it's science or not, it comes down to what somebody thinks looks good? Whether it's the artist or the historian attributing that judgment to the artist, or perhaps to the artist's social circle, whoever they might have been. But in the end, this is science that merges and gets sort of smudged a little bit by humanities and art sciences, if you can call them sciences at all.
Professor?
Yeah.
Do you think this could have been made by like a kid? I feel like in art history, we forget that people who aren't adults can make art.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely possible, right? There are those who talk about that. I don't know if anyone's ever entertained it in this particular example, but I have read where people consider the possibility that it was just an amateur, or it was just a kid, who was making marks for fun, and you can't assume that people didn't do that just because they weren't Homo sapiens, and that's a very reasonable possibility. Absolutely, I'm not closing the door on that at all. What you might hear occasionally as an objection would be, and I'm not saying it's relevant here, is, well, we'll look at the intentionality of the lines. So there are characteristics that psychologists have long established are different in the way children make marks when they're making art versus the way most humans will try, or most adult humans, will try to make similar drawings or images. There are always exceptions, so you can never make absolute conclusions. But certain kinds of marks are made with the authority of adulthood that might not be made the same way by the exploring the psyche of a child. And so those are the kinds of really nebulous arguments that are flowing in the field for lack of hard evidence one way or the other. But yeah, absolutely. Okay, So I think I do have my image here. This is Morocco's, the northwest tip of the continent of Africa, and includes uh, the passageway from the continent of Africa to that of Europe via Spain and Gibraltar, etc. And it's just northwest of Algeria. On the right, our woman of Willendorf, which is still considered a rather extraordinary anomalous object for various reasons, but is part of a group of objects of like kind that are seen as obviously Neolithic in the sense that they represent the human figure, but are not Neolithic in date. They are Paleolithic. We think of them as dating from, at least 20,000 years ago, maybe 25 to 30,000 years ago. And on the left, so-called Venus, this one is the Venus of Tantan, which was found in Morocco about 20 odd years ago. And the problem with this one, it's a very small object. It was presented as the find of the century because it was a fertility figurine that had been dated by carbon dating to about 500,000 years ago, which would mean that Neanderthal artists had not only made marks on walls or negative handprints or smudges, but that they had made representational human figures in 3 dimensions. And this has never been established. People in the field are skeptical, to say the least, of the authenticity of this object, that either it simply happened to have these marks in these divots in the shape they happened to assume, or somebody fooled around with the rock to make it look a little more like what they wanted it to look like. So that one stays out of the books, at least out of the official, reckoning of the state of knowledge today, at least so far. Many objects that are now considered really important in establishing the lineage of prehistoric art have been in collections for 100 years or so, but are only now being reconsidered. So that often happens as well. Okay, let's go to Algeria. This is Tasli-in-Ajr. Tasli-in-Ajr. I don't really know how to pronounce it. I'm just doing my best. And it is about 4,500 years old. It's a rock painting. There are parts of this that might qualify as cave formations, but really most of it is outdoor rock painting. Not quite the same as petroglyphs and rock carvings, but very closely related. And we're all familiar to some extent, aren't we, with art of this kind in southern Utah and throughout Utah. It abounds, as you probably know. This is much the same sort of thing. As you can tell, this is a pretty darn good artist who really thought hard about the anatomy of a cow, and wanted it to look as much like a real cow as possible. Whether there is a style, a conscious style, as we saw in the first image I showed of a rock painting, or not, is debatable. And that's another matter, is when you do start classifying by style, you quickly run into the problem that some people's style is another group's unconscious rendering eccentricity rather than a conscious stylistic attitude. Here is another and more famous image from Tasli-in-Ajr, thought to date from about the same time, and suddenly our Paleolithic cow becomes Neolithic, and even some people like to say proto-historical art, because we have a group of people who lived there then. Some people who live near Tasli-in-Ajr now insist that there are some patterns of movement in the figures and even some marks on the bodies that signify traditions they themselves claim as their own, which would mean that we're talking about something which is not far from the history of the people who live there today. That's not entirely uncommon either, that we find groups of people living near a prehistoric art site who claim affiliation with that lineage. In the absence of direct confirming testimony from the people who made the picture thousands of years ago, these claims remain very difficult to substantiate. In any event, it's Neolithic, obviously, because these are women who are moving, working, or possibly dancing. And they have a characteristic style, which is the Taslian-Adjer style that most people think of. Here, an example of what we get in Utah, not unlike it in many respects. And the only real difference, aside from the location and the specifics of the animals, etc., is that these date from thousands of years later. So when we look at most of our earliest, even our earliest Fremont images in Utah, they are definitely Neolithic artworks by prehistoric groups. But it all depends on when those people arrived and at what rate or with what interruptions in their rate of development from this stage of human creative impulse to a next stage they belong to. And in this case, these are people who came later. They came a long, long time ago, just not quite as long as people came to Taslian-Adjer in Algeria. And going back to Taslian-Adjer, this is the most famous image, I believe, because it's reproduced all the time as the running woman. Some people call her the dancing woman. A really quite stunning piece of stylized figuration, as you can see. The dotted lines are generally assumed to be a representation of scarification, as we call it. Scarification, S-C-A-R, with an ification after it, meaning the scarring pattern. And this is because little dotted lines are very often the way scarification appears in modern human beings, especially in certain traditions in West and Northwest Africa. So when this kind of line imagery is seen, it's usually described as scarification marks. That is just a guess because this is prehistoric, so bear that in mind. Always take these descriptions with a grain of salt. But you'll notice that those lines, whether they are scarification or some kind of painted pattern or just an expressive adornment of the figure by the artist, are supportive of the rhythm of the figure's contour. So the contour line drawing that defines the perimeter of the running figure is echoed by this repeating dotted line pattern, which suggests a real sensibility, not unlike that we expect of many of our artists today. Whether that's accurate or not, I don't know. Okay, so I want to digress now and talk about a different issue for a couple of minutes. And then I have a reading assignment that I recommend. But what I really want to do is talk about Western ways of seeing versus non-Western ways of seeing as they first became an issue of dispute in Western culture, which didn't really happen until the beginning of the 20th century. There were examples of non-Western and prehistoric non-Western art in Europe that were in collections long before that. As early as the 16th and 17th centuries, there were collections that were consisted of objects that the owners in Europe were proud to share and display. But rarely were such objects referred to seriously as art by Westerners, by Europeans. Only around 1902 to 1904 do we start to see a really significant widespread shift in attitude with regard to the reception by Westerners of non-Western artworks as art. And probably the best known example, which is why I'm looking at it here with you, is Pablo Picasso, who developed one of the three primary um, formal modernist movements, along with his French colleague Georges Braque, called Cubism of the 20th century. And that movement was in significant part inspired by non-Western, specifically West African art. Here you see detail from that famous painting we've been looking at on the right, the Demoiselle d'Avignon from 1906-7-8. In detail, you can see that one face of one of the two figures on the right, along with the mask that scholars believe was being painted by Picasso as he finished that face. This was a mask in Picasso's own possession by 1906, so it's not unreasonable to assume that. So here I want to read an excerpt that is really worth considering, I think. It says it better than I could say it. In the hands of these men, the works of African carvers underwent a radical transformation. They became something they had never been before. For Picasso, Apollinaire, who was a poet and a champion of the early Cubist, Picasso and Braque, and their German colleagues, which is a reference to some of the earliest expressionist painters working at the same time. What was interesting about African objects had to do with their form. That means the style, how they looked, the decisions made about proportions, about texture, about color, about pattern, about balance and composition, the principles of design. Their meaning, context, use, history, even the identity of the objects was unimportant. The key for them, the European modernists, was style. They were particularly interested by African approaches to the human body, by the ways in which it was depicted. Drawing on these approaches allowed the Western modernist artists and their allies to challenge artistic conventions prevalent in Europe at the time. How and why these modes of representation had developed and who had created them were questions left mostly unexplored. As far as the European artists were concerned, the only thing of import was the expressive force of the forms. So what's really being said here is the Europeans discover and respect genuine admiration, even you might say infatuation with non-Western art objects like this Fang mask we're looking at. But they do so in large part because they are motivated to explain their positions to other Europeans. They are involved in an internal dispute of decades longevity between traditionalists who reject the ideas of modernism and the modernists who reject the ideals of academic classicism. The question what those actual African artists who made the thing that's spawning this debate might have had to say about this matter never arises. Okay. Here is an example of early influence of non-Western, specifically in this case, I think it's fair to say African art on Western art. This is a famous painting, one of the series of paintings known as the Dance series by the French painter Henri Matisse from 1909. And I think you can see there are some connections. This is not a direct connection, but some things it has in common. What you're really looking at is an artist who can draw, who is a graduate of the School of Fine Arts in Paris, maybe not the greatest draftsman of the human figure in history, but he was a competent, well-trained student of an academic training ground, Matisse, who chooses early in his adult career to draw crudely, hesitantly, awkwardly, and without respect for the tradition of illusionistic, volumetric drawing. So there is no suggestion really, or no more than the the barest suggestion, pardon my pun, of the three-dimensional bodies that are involved in this dance, let alone the space that they occupy. A big blotch of blue and a big blotch of green, representing sky and earth and nothing really more. Those decisions are naturally resisted and objected to by a great many people in the art world in 1909, who still see this as just dreadfully awkward, inept, ugly, bad art. And on the other side, there is a swiftly rising population of increasingly empowered younger people who have absolutely had it by 1909 with the legacy of the classical school, much of which they see as having impoverished itself through unethical and immoral redirection of its expert history to serve the aims of the buyership. And so there are these antipathies, very real, strong, emotionally charged antipathies between these generations, which will only get worse as World War I begins in 1914. And this is what that kind of African influence on Western art consists of, for the most part. A new excitement about formal issues that involve, from the perspective of the Western artists who adopt these objects as models, involve an embrace of and a justification of abstraction and the rejection of finish and polish in workmanship. And on the part of the Africans, well, they're not involved at all. Their opinions, their knowledge, their history are entirely ignored for at least another 20 years. And then by the 1930s, there emerge several important early European historians of non-Western art, and some of them specialize in African art, and we have ourselves underway, and we now know a good deal more than we used to. This is a photograph of Josephine Baker, who's a very, very, very widely popular stage entertainer and musician, singer in Paris, France. She was an American by birth, but she migrated to France as a young woman to escape racism wherever she found it in America, and was able to find herself in a very different social context in Europe. She became very, very popular, and part of the reputation she had, she won the Legion of Honor from the French government, for example, came from the dances she performed in what she called the African Fantasy series. And you see her here wearing one of the costumes of the African Fantasy series. This is the kind of adaptation of what we're seeing as authentically African imagery by Europeans, even into the 1920s. When it comes to mainstream culture, performative culture or visual art in Europe and in the United States, even in the 1920s, the 1930s, into the 1940s, there isn't really, in retrospect, from our perspective, almost unbelievable ignorance still being displayed by the Westerners with regard to their admiration of or reception of African art. Okay, I'm going to continue. This is from Peter Mark's very famous article from about 20 years ago called "Is There Such a Thing as African Art?" It is in this setting that Africans, the one that I described, I was quoting from him earlier, it is in this setting that African sculpture first entered the realm of art history, around 1904 to 1902 maybe to 1920. The history, that is, of what Westerners define as art. It did so, however, not as an autonomous entity, as an art form worthy of study on its own terms, but as an extension of European interests. this non-Western art, African art, became art not because of what it was intrinsically, but because it had been adopted as a source of inspiration by European artists. In other words, only when the Europeans pick up a West African mask and start fooling around with what they get from it on their canvases with their oil paints, um, do Western critics, historians, and artists start to call those source images works of art. And only because they remain relevant to an understanding of developments in European art. So here's one example by Carl Schmidt-Rottluff. It's a good example, I think, of German Expressionism's early response to African modes of representation of the human figure, particularly in mask and small figure wood-carved art. An African-American artist named Aaron Douglas, part of what we call the Harlem Renaissance movement from the 1920s and 30s, is another case in point. Here we have an American artist raised and educated in America, in the U.S., who becomes fascinated by the modernist scene that is going like gangbusters, way ahead of schedule in Paris compared to that of New York, and who becomes very receptive of the latest trends coming out of the modern art scene in Paris, France, but who is also, understandably, an American tied to the American scene and wants to integrate his own vision of European formal developments in the modernist schools with his embrace of American regionalist subjects and themes. Not to mention that his work is, a few of his works anyway, are considered really quite colossally important as harbingers of the response of Black American artists to white racist art world in the 1930s. That was an example of a French Art Deco sculptor here working in incised relief on a figure that is, in retrospect, connectable with some of the proto Art Deco styles we were just looking at from, say, Schmidt-Rottluff's school of German Expressionism. And here is Aaron Douglas, an ink on paper that was made to be used for illustration in a book that was published, so it would have been made into a print, in which you can see the subject matter of the book, which actually was about an African group of African characters, treated in a style that reflects both Cubism and Expressionism from Europe, with some evidence of early understanding of Art Deco, the design style of the 20s and 30s. Here are a couple more examples. The Spirit of Africa, Rebirth, and one of his larger oil paintings, Idols of the South, from a very different subject, of course, of jazz musicians and their predecessors on the islands of the Caribbean. That was the theme of that group. What I'm trying to say here is that we even see that appropriation instinct of Western European artists among some of our best professional African American artists in the 1920s and 30s, which is not surprising. They're artists of the same group, the same cultural background, artistically speaking, as many of their white peers. It isn't until we get to the next generation of Harlem Renaissance artists, younger group, including Jacob Lawrence, for example, that we start to see a much more, I guess you might say, a more rebellious stylistic reaction against that easy appropriation of by Western artists of non-Western tropes. Okay, back to our continent of Africa. There it is. If you look into Africa, you see all the countries. 53 or 54, I think, is the number. And one of them still has its sovereignty in dispute, at least one. This has always been a place of conflict. but the reasons for those conflicts are not necessarily what you might at first assume. For example, in the Middle East, conflict has historically been motivated by climate and by the availability of arable land. That is not generally the reason for conflict, border conflict and border dispute on the continent of Africa proper. But I'm being told by my timer that we're out of time, so I'll pick up where we've left off here next time because I don't want to keep you longer than 50 minutes. 50 minutes of blather from your professor at one go is plenty. Thank you for your input, and please feel free, any of you or all of you, to interrupt with questions or comments anytime. Okay? Have a good one, everyone. Bye bye.